So our next two speakers are Dr. Jack Schneider and Dr. Jennifer Berkshire.
Jennifer, maybe I'll dive in.
Go ahead, dive.
Yeah, go
and
ahead.
and then you can tell everybody what I forgot to talk about. How about that?
That sounds great.
All right. Since the word history has been applied to this event, and since I was trained as an education historian, I don't really do that work much anymore. I tend to do more present policy analysis work. Jennifer and I have a new book out that is really about present policy efforts to unmake public education. But I got excited seeing that word history there and decided to take us way back in time and talk a little bit about the founding ideals of public education. And it's worth noting that those ideals were not always fully realized or even partially realized, that they eventually become realized more and more over time. And I'll continue to talk about the ways in which they haven't been realized, but it would, of course, be ironic to talk about the ideal of an integrated public school in the 18th century, when, of course, a massive percentage of young people were turned away just on principle because they weren't a part of the racially privileged group. They weren't a part of the ethnically privileged group, the linguistically privileged group, the religiously privileged group. So bear with me when I say that the origins of public education are rooted in a democratic ideal of diverse young people coming together. Now, of course, that definition of diversity was in the 18th century, right? When we're talking about the founding period, a very limited conception of diversity. And it expanded over time because of the way that marginalized racial groups, new immigrants, non-native English speakers, families with students with special needs fought to be included. The reason they were successful over time, mostly, is that we took those ideals seriously. And eventually, the ideal of a system that serves everyone became more and more realized. So when we think about this ideal, my old mentor, David Labrie, always referred to it as democratic equality. And this is the original mission of public education. The reason why the founders in the 18th century, and we didn't have a public education system at the time, but the reason why they strongly supported the idea of taxpayer-funded public education is that they believed that we could not keep our republic without it. That public education was too important to be left to the whims of the marketplace, which should strike us right now in this moment as ironic, given how much policy is being proposed from state to state right now that would expose public education to the market and, in fact, would end public education, would privatize public education such that it were a consumer good like any others. But the founders believed that the skills learned in school, and these were a broad set of skills, not merely those that could be tested by a at the time not invented standardized test. This would be skills that are needed for citizenship in a democracy, but also far more than that. Going to school with different kinds of people, learning how to live together. That's a phrase that Thurgood Marshall would take up. What would that be? About 150 years later. So when Thurgood Marshall wrote in a famous dissent that our children need to go to school together if we are ever going to learn to live together, right? He's building on this ideal of democratic equality. He's tapping into that and reminding us of this original purpose of public education. This begins to change over time. First we get this big push for public schools. It's called the Common School Movement in the 19th century. So it begins around 1820, carries through the Civil War. And during the Common School era, you get leaders like Henry Barnard and Horace Mann who are making the case for the same kind of public education that the founders were making, right? That this should be for everybody in the community. Again, I'll note their definition of everybody at the time was quite different than ours, much to the detriment of American society and particular groups. We're talking about African Americans, we're talking about Mexican Americans who America essentially captured by expanding its borders and then rejected from its education system. We're talking about kids with special needs who were turned away at the door until about the 1950s and 60s. And so this idea of democratic equality was the driving ideal of public education through the Common School era, up through the end of the Civil War, and then actually continued to be a driving ideal in Reconstruction. So if you look in Southern states, in their constitutions, funding public education was one of the criteria for readmission to the Union after the Civil War and opening it up to everybody. This was, again, because the idea of public education was not about getting ahead. It was not about advancing the economy. It was not about preparing young people with 21st century skills, whatever that means. It was about building democracy and ensuring something resembling equality. So what changes? In the early 20th century, we get a new kind of thinking introduced into public education, and it can be distilled to the phrase social efficiency. The thinking was that the schools could sort people for their places in life, that the schools could identify talent and channel those people into places where we needed talent, that the schools could identify merit and make sure that the most meretricious people were being rewarded, that the schools effectively could be doing the kind of sorting that we see in our society today, but would be doing it faster, smarter, and fairer. And of course, we know that the history of that is kind of an ugly one. That's where we get tracking. That's where we get the introduction of intelligence testing. The first standardized tests came during this period. And again, we see some of these efforts to sort people, like tracking, for instance, hewing really closely to demography. So racially marginalized kids were the most likely to be tracked into vocational programs, low-income kids as well, kids whose parents were not native English speakers. And we can actually see this thread today, just like we can see the democratic equality thread run through to today in the way that many of us still think about the purpose of public education. We can see this social efficiency piece. So Anthony mentioned Arne Duncan, mentioned Bill Gates, mentioned a lot of people who are big believers in the idea that the schools will sort people. Arne Duncan talked relentlessly about preparing students for work and using education as a way of competing in a global economy. Competing in a global economy is something that we may want to do, but our education system was not designed to do that. A lot is lost if that's all that we talk about, and it's not necessarily the best way to prepare people for work. There's a great new book out by Tina Groger that describes actually the rise of vocational education as an intentional way of breaking craft unions, of preparing people in school so that they didn't have to be prepared through apprenticeships and other forms of on-the-job training. There are reasons to be skeptical. The third strand that we see if we're thinking about the motivating values of education, we don't really see until about the 1950s, and that can be described as social mobility, the use of education to get ahead. Prior to then, really we saw a system that was so limited in terms of access for young people that the only people who were graduating, by, let's say, the early 20th century, the only people who were graduating from high school tended to be from racially and economically privileged families. But there's a push to open up the schools. And that push in the early 20th century was driven by people's belief that those who were getting a high school education were getting ahead because of the education. And in some cases, that was true, right? They were learning a lot of things that actually mattered and that helped them get ahead, that it wasn't just about credentialing. And so they fought to get their kids access to a high school education. And we know that as high school became more and more accessible for people, that a college degree became the new status-bearing credential in education. Today, we can see that many families are pushing their children to go beyond a BA and to get a graduate degree as a means of distinguishing themselves in the marketplace. So this use of education, this is a third use, the use by individuals as a way to gain an advantage over others in a society that has limited rewards and that is seeking a way to dole those rewards out. We believe in this country in the myth of meritocracy. We believe that if you went to Harvard or Yale or Princeton or, a number of other high status schools, that you're smarter, or maybe you've worked harder than other people. But of course, there's a very strong correlation between academic prestige, attending a high status college or university, and being from a high income background, a high income household. So this use of education, we see rising more and more over the decades to the point today where it's almost the only thing we talk about when we're talking about education, right? Education as a private good, not as a public good, not as something that is good for all of us, right? When we think about why do we fund education with public tax dollars, why do we do that, right? Why don't we say, it's your kid, it's your problem, you go figure it out? Or why didn't we say, it's your kid, it's your problem, but you don't have any money, so we'll just give you some money and you go make the choice? We didn't do that because there was a recognition that we all benefit from this. In the same way that we all benefit from roads and parks and clean air, we all benefit from having an educated populace. And again, over time, this idea of who is a part of the populace, who's a citizen, who's included, who's an American has expanded and has become fairer and has become something that better realizes this initial vision of democratic equality. But of course, what we talk about most is the private good, right? What's good for me and my kid? What can I get my kid in education to give her an advantage over other kids? And this is why we see things like opportunity hoarding, right? This is why we see parents moving to school districts because they looked at the greatschools.org rating and they don't know a thing about the school, but they believe that it will give their kid an advantage. This is why there are US News and World Report rankings of colleges and universities, right? There's an entire culture and system of structures that support the use of education as a private good for people to get ahead. And of course, we know that in the competition of all against all, those with the most privilege are going to win, right? We are essentially going to have a privilege laundering machine in which the most advantaged enter into the school system, and then they come out the other end having been blessed with the veneer of meritocratic worth. It isn't simply that they're privileged, it is that they are smarter and harder working than everybody else, and that's why they ended up on top. And that's why they have disproportional access to social and economic goodies in our society. What we need is to remember why we are doing this in the first place. We need to remember that public education is a public good. It is a public benefit to all of us. This is why we fund it with our tax dollars. This is why we don't leave it to the whims of the market. This is why we don't say, go ahead and teach your kid whatever kind of science you want your kid to be taught, right? Because these young people go out and they become members of our society, right? We are all affected by that. In the same way that air from one city that is produced does not stay there, it moves around. Young people go out into our society and they act on it. And so what we ought to be doing instead of talking about things like, funding the child, as Betsy DeVos used to say. Give a family a voucher so that they can choose whatever kind of education they want, public or private. We should instead be talking about what are the ways to capture that ideal of democratic equality. What are the ways that we can make our public schools truly public? And that requires much different policies, like seeking full racial and economic integration in our schools, fully funding our schools, making sure that if our schools aren't fully integrated, that schools serving historically disadvantaged kids actually have more to work with to try to close the education debt that is owed to particular kinds of communities. Ensuring that teaching is a valued profession and that teachers are adequately remunerated for their work such that we have well-qualified people who enter the schools and who stay in the schools and who don't feel like they are being deprofessionalized through a slew of relentless reforms designed to narrow the mission of education. And then finally, we ought to be thinking about what's the full mission of schools, all right? It isn't to teach kids what a machine can grade on a standardized assessment in 2 subject areas, right? That's not the full mission of school. The full mission of school is to prepare young people for their lives, to prepare young people to live together and work together, to be members of communities. And that requires a whole lot more than just teaching them math and English such that they can pass their standardized tests. All right, I'll stop there and I'll kick it over to Jennifer. And then if between the two of us, we haven't covered everything, we'll eventually get to it.
So Jack and I have spent the last few months talking to all kinds of groups all over the country about the book, but I think this is the first event we've done where history is in the title, and I cannot recall a time when I have seen Jack Schneider this excited. So thank you, Our Revolution East Bay. You've done something really wonderful this Saturday. So our book tries to answer a very present day question, which is how did something as old as school vouchers come roaring back to life, and we are now seeing it being sold across the country as quote unquote disruptive innovation, right? As though it's a sort of Elon Musk trip to the future. And so the two of us, I'm an education journalist, Jack is a historian. We really tried to answer that question. And we didn't know as we were writing the book, obviously, that a pandemic would happen and that schools across the country would suddenly have to shut their doors. So I think we probably understate in the book the danger to public education. I think that the last year has really been a wake-up call about the precarity of a foundational institution. But I just want to, I think we're all a little bit in a blue bubble. Both, we're in Massachusetts, you guys are in California, but in states all over the country, something like 25 state legislatures have introduced these measures that don't just expand private school vouchers, but introduce these sweeping proposals that would either give money directly to parents and, let them take the money and direct it to a private school, or they open up the spending more broadly than that. The disruptive innovation of the day is called an education savings account. And as we look back through history, we discovered that the first time that this appears is actually during the Reagan administration, right? That the Reagan folks introduced an education savings account. And so when you hear people across the country now peddling it in states like West Virginia, where they've enacted a sweeping version, or in New Hampshire, where they're debating it right now, it's being talked about as though it's something brand new, but in fact, it's very old. What happened, though, was back in the Reagan days, when this idea first came up, it was widely rejected. The public responded with, pretty much outrage. They thought that the idea of steering tax dollars away from public institutions to private religious schools was really offensive. The idea that you could be denied entry to a school because you didn't believe in a particular faith was one that people had a really hard time swallowing. That seemed pretty, foundational and fundamental, right? We have this thing called freedom of religion and separation of church and state. Well, a lot has changed since then. I joked on Twitter the other day that, you may be surprised that we don't really seem to do separation of church and state anymore. And one of the things that's happened is that we've had this sort of long parade of court cases, Supreme Court cases, chiseling away at this idea. And so not only do you have states with these elaborate workarounds that enable taxpayer dollars to fund religious schools via tax credits or scholarship granting organizations, but increasingly there's a push to basically compel states to fund private religious education. So as Jack and I traced this history, I think I in particular, because I'm not an education historian, I was really surprised to see how far back this went, and that basically you had people making the exact same argument in the 1990s that we're hearing today. So what happened? Why was it that in the 1980s, in a state like California, when school vouchers were put on the ballot in 1993, people voted it down 2-1? We have seen this happen again and again. So what caused them to come roaring back? Well, there are a couple of things, and one I'm going to enlist Jack's help in explaining. But a real, I think where we have to start is that the way that the Democrats started to talk about public education really changed. Some of this has to do with what Jack was laying out. This idea, this embrace of education as a private good. This idea that really took hold in the 1990s, that education was primarily around about workforce preparation. The Clinton folks love to talk about, what you earn is what you learn, right? And that we were going to be a country of winners and losers, and that the people who were left behind, well, that was pretty much their fault. And that if you were going to get ahead, you had to invest in yourself. So we fast forward to today, we see that view of education has turned out to be really corrosive, right? That we have only a third of people in our country hold bachelor's degrees. So what kind of message does that send to everybody else? That, if you didn't get ahead, it's your own fault. So we've got that problem. And then basically, the Democrats really started to talk about education in a way that made privatization seem much more palatable. Back in the Reagan administration, I went back and looked at the newspaper coverage when he and his then Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett, who may be familiar to some of you, when they first rolled out their idea that the money would follow the child, right? That they would make funding to low-income schools, quote unquote, portable. And people responded like, well, isn't that going to leave the kids in the kids who stay behind? Isn't that going to leave them worse off? Well, what happened in those intervening decades that now arguments that are even more extreme are basically just repeated by a gullible press, but also, we don't seem to have language for pushing back. And a lot of it is that centrist Democrats in particular, neoliberal Democrats as I'm fond of referring to them, really embrace the idea of education as a private good that was primarily about workforce preparation, and that we needed to embrace this ethos of competition, right? That parents should be able to choose their school the way they choose any other consumer good. And that was the thing that would lift, that was the tide that would lift all boats, or it would sink the losers. And that was okay, because we shouldn't have, if schools were failing kids, they shouldn't be allowed to keep going. And so when you go back and you look and hear the Reagan people using this identical language, it's like, wow, now Democrats talk that same way. And we're left in this kind of crazy situation where suddenly an institution that's so foundational to our democracy is looking really vulnerable. It's looking really shaky. But when we need Joe Biden, for example, to come out swinging and make the kind of case for public education that he's been making for voting rights, he doesn't really have the vocabulary to do that. That they're so used to talking about education in this really desiccated way that the only thing that they're really able to reach for is talk about test scores, for example. So Jack, I want you to cover one last piece of this. Jack and I have a podcast, and often what we do on the podcast is bring in other historians and experts. And we had somebody from California, David Menifee-Leiby from Pomona College, to talk about the breakdown of the coalition that I think Anthony did a nice job of laying out. And that was this idea that you had Democrats who were all about accountability joining forces with Republicans who like the idea of private school vouchers, and they compromise, and everyone goes all in for charters. And as Jack's going to explain to us, that coalition has unraveled, and it has profound implications for not just public education across the country, but states like California. So, Jack, I know this is one of your favorite questions, so you take it away.
Yeah, great. So I won't use the language of democratic equality and social efficiency and social mobility, other than to say that when we're talking about the economy, we're talking largely about social efficiency. And when we're talking about getting ahead, and the sort of bootstraps ethos, we're talking about social mobility, and we're talking about what public education actually is and is for. We're talking about democratic equality. And in the 1980s, that was the sort of the last era where we saw a real difference between Republicans and Democrats, particularly at the federal level, in education policy. So Republicans still favored religion in schools. You see Reagan making speeches about that. They still favored vouchers. Reagan, as Jennifer mentioned, lost on that. They were still, pushing for textbooks to cover particular material and omit other material. The Democrats were still supporting unions, had not yet given up on school integration, and were still pushing for an increase in funding. And what we see in the 1990s is a kind of détente, where the neoliberal Democrats essentially make an alliance with mainstream conservatives to say, let's shelve the policy efforts that are too far to the margins here. Let's shelve the far left stuff and the far right stuff. Democrats, you stop supporting teachers' unions. You give up the push for racial integration. You give up your push for more funding in schools. And we on the right will give up the religion in schools piece, at least for a while. We'll stop pushing for vouchers. We won't bring the culture war anymore. And let's work together to advance a vision of education that is rooted in a kind of marketplace ethos that will strengthen the economy, that will sort young people in our society, and that will lift them up through their hard work, right? This is a kind of neoliberal ideology that conservatives also subscribed to, at least with regard to education. And the things that they pushed for were standardized testing, right? High stakes tests, because again, the theory there was that this is what corporations do, right? Schools should be run like businesses, and that they should also be exposed to the market. Again, this is the neoliberal, centrist, conservative logic here of improving education by shelving the more ideologically extreme policies that they had been pushing forward and building a kind of consensus approach to education policy. And that's what we've been living in for the past several decades. That's why there's no difference between George H.W. Bush's education plan and Bill Clinton's education plan. No difference between Bill Clinton's education plan and George W. Bush's education plan. No difference between George W. Bush's education plan and Barack Obama's education plan. They differed in many other ways, but not in their approach to education. And then we got Betsy DeVos, and Betsy DeVos broke the treaty. Betsy DeVos decided to dredge up some of the old conservative dreams, like vouchers. Betsy DeVos decided that that was her moment, right? And she was essentially right that even though she didn't drive any of her policy forward, she normalized it through her rhetoric. And she really gave voice to conservatives at the state level, and that's where we've seen the deepest attacks on public education. So Californians don't have to drive too far to get to Arizona, where there's just really some scary stuff happening in public education, right? Public funds being loaded onto untraceable debit cards, pulling money out of the schools and going to pay for they don't know what, because this is by design. The plan is to pull money out of the public schools and give it to people, and who cares where it goes as long as the public education system is weakened such that eventually it collapses and they need to build a private system. So DeVos saw that the neoliberal Democrats had essentially paved a runway for her, and she decided she was going to try to land an airplane on it. And then all the centrist Democrats seemed really surprised that she was doing that, right? Cory Booker was horrified that this woman who he had shared stages with was suddenly doing the thing she had always wanted to do. Shame on these centrist Democrats for not seeing this coming, right? For them, this was the final compromise, right? Charters, which expose schools to some limited degree of the influence of the market. For centrist Democrats, that was it. That was the final compromise. That was the end of the story. How naive, right? Of course, conservatives who are in favor of dismantling public education by introducing voucher schemes are thinking that this is just one step towards their final game plan, right? So, the failures of the centrist left here are just as much a part of this story as the sort of long, patient policy game that the far right has been pushing and playing in education. And that's where we are now, right? This treaty has been broken. And it's like the Biden administration doesn't know it, right? It's like they just woke up from a 100-year nap, or maybe only a 20-year nap. And they think that we're still in this neoliberal consensus where, limited choice through charters and standardized testing to enable a kind of performance management framework that might be used at, let's say, Alcoa in the manufacturing of aluminum, that would apply to public education. And what we actually need is a radically progressive vision that is the equivalent on the left of what DeVos was proposing on the right.
And I just want to throw in one more brief point. We often get asked, as we were talking about our book, A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, what is the vision of the future that privatization advocates have? And the answer is actually quite simple. It looks like higher ed, right? In higher education, it's up to you, the consumer, to decide how much you want to spend in order to invest in your human capital. And there is a robust private loan market to support you. And it's not a coincidence that we're talking to you in California tonight, where the dream of public higher ed, free public higher ed, really died. And you think about how Ronald Reagan launched his career off of sort of culture warring your institutions of public higher ed, how he made it about campus protests and race, and how he, systematically turned the public, and the conservative public in particular, against the idea of that people should be able to attend public higher education for free, that should basically be an extension of K-12. So when we look at what's happening with K-12 today, and you see these very aggressive privatization pushes underway, but you also see this really alarming kind of culture warring of K-12. We've gotten, I think, pretty used to by now of seeing the right at the state level use culture war arguments in order to justify defunding public higher ed. If you look at what's happened to state colleges in places like Wisconsin, for example. But increasingly you're seeing these same sorts of arguments being extended to K-12, right? That you and the Republican Party shouldn't support funding K-12 because your kids will just be indoctrinated there, right? So think about all the attention that something like the 1619 project has gotten. We see on the East Coast, for example, they're at hyper local levels in New Hampshire where, people, small groups of people get together to vote on raising money to improve the school gym. Right now they're getting ready to pass a version of what they call, a divisive concepts bill that would ban teachers from talking about sexism or racism. Right? This is meant to convey to the public that public education is basically unsafe. It's dangerous. It indoctrinates your kids, and therefore you should pull your kids out of it. You should support privatization legislation like school vouchers, and that frankly, we shouldn't be in support of funding it. It's a very old argument, but it's come roaring back to life, largely because of the pandemic. So I think you've heard enough from Jack and I. So we're going to pass things along. And we actually included in the chat some links to things we've written, some more interviews that we've done if you're interested in this. And thanks for having us.
Wow, that was great. Thanks a lot, Jack and Jen. I actually realized I didn't give y'all a proper intro, so I want to do that right now because you guys deserve it, and it will also clear up some of the other things that we talked about just now. So Dr. Jack Schneider is an assistant professor of education at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, where he leads the Beyond Test Scores project. An award-winning scholar, his work broadly explores the influence of history, culture, and rhetoric in education policy. The author of 4 books, including co-author of Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, which we just heard Jennifer talking about. Dr. Schneider writes frequently about education in outlets like The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and he is the co-founder of the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment and the co-host of the education policy podcast, Have You Heard? And the co-editor of History of Education Quarterly. So that's probably why he was so excited about talking about history. All right, so Dr. Jennifer Berkshire writes about education politics for the nation, the New Republic, the Baffler, the New York Times, and many other publications. As the creator and the co-host of the Education Policy Podcast, Have You Heard? She teaches aspiring podcasters in the journalism program at Boston College and the Labor Studies program at UMass Amherst. Berkshire discovered her passion for storytelling while covering her series of bitter labor battles that racked her native Midwest in the early 1990s. She is the author of More Worlds to Negotiate, John Dunlop and the Art of Problem Solving, and co-author of The Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door. And she is also a licensed public school teacher. So that was the intro that I missed that I should have gotten to before, which was definitely necessary. So now I'm going to bring it on over to Mark, one of our other Our Revolution East Bay board members, and he's going to introduce Mike Hutchinson, the OUSD school board director. Mark, you unmuted and ready to go?
I'm unmuted and ready to go. And always give titles and qualifications before you bring the people on. That gives the audience a little bit more attention.
Yep.
So thank you, Jack Schneider and Jennifer Berkshire, for your presentations. Marvelous. It was edifying and clarifying and strengthening. So thank you both.